My name is Morten Elvang. Welcome to the Agile Strategy Meetup group. Today we have the honor of having Gary Hamel visiting us to share your view on where you see strategy going and also offer advice for anyone who is new in the field. As I briefly told before everybody called in, we have had a bit of an odyssey where a number of people have been talking to the same question. So really looking forward to hearing your point of view. And in terms of format, we will do it so that 30 minutes for you and your presentation, and then after that, open up for question and discussion. Is that okay? So in that case, please, Gary, welcome.
All right. Well, thank you, Morten, and nice to have this chance to chat about strategy. You know, it's not something I talk about so much these days, although my history as a strategy professor now for quite a long number of years. I've been on the faculty of the London Business School for more than 40 years. Let's leave it at that. And when I was a very young faculty member, the first course I taught was on corporate strategy. But, you know, it's interesting. I find that strategy is like not necessarily a, doesn't get much love or attention these days. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also try to share a few things that at least I think I've learned through the years. I've worked with, I don't know, maybe more than 100 companies around the world on strategy, and out of that has come billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars of new market value, and so on. So maybe I've learned a little. I'm going to let you judge that, but I do have to be honest that I started thinking about strategy when these two guys were running the world. So that gives you a little sense of how long ago this was. But as I said, you know, there was a time when I think there's been ups and downs in strategy. I'm going to share something with you. This is kind of fun. This is something that my colleagues gave to me. This is I had a little spot in Business Week magazine in August 1996, and this was the cover story. It said strategic planning. It's back. And of course, they maybe made the mistake of putting the CEO of Sears on the cover, which is, you know, kind of a moribund company, pretty much dead. And they have this little section on me looking a whole lot younger than I do now. So that was like, whatever, almost 30 years ago. But if you look at kind of the date, I was just looking at, you know, Google Ngram and looking at kind of the relative attention that strategic planning, corporate strategy gets versus some other ideas. And now more recently, over the last few years, a huge focus on digital transformation, which maybe now masquerades as strategy in a lot of companies. But let me give you just a little bit of history on my thinking about this, and then I'll get to kind of what I think are hopefully some core points. You know, when I was a young strategy professor, this was shortly after Michael Porter had written, you know, his very influential book on competitive strategy, then competitive advantage. And essentially the question he tried to answer as an industrial economist was, why are some strategies more profitable than others? Right? Why at the time did Boeing make more money than McDonnell Douglas? Did IBM make more money than Digital Equipment, GE than Honeywell, Coca-Cola than PepsiCo? And he was essentially asking, what are the roots of a monopolistic or an oligopolistic advantage? And of course, what Michael assumed was you had an industry that already existed with a fairly stable structure where most of the players were, you know, kind of playing by more or less the same rules. And so, you know, that was kind of the famous five forces and so on. And I have to say, every MBA kid still learns all of this. But what I was seeing at the same time, by the time I started to teach at the London Business School, there was a new set of companies emerging. They're not very new anymore, but at the time they were new. And they were all kind of rule breakers. They came kind of out of nowhere. Some of them redefined the industry in very dramatic ways. They were kind of the stormtroopers of creative destruction at the time. And that suggested to me that there was another deep question that needed to be answered. Not you know, once you see a strategy, why are some more profitable than others? But in a way, where do these new rule-breaking strategies come from? What's their genesis? And maybe how do you learn to create your own game-changing strategy? So that led to a piece about the time that Business Week article came out back in 1996 called Strategies Revolution, later to a book called Leading the Revolution, where I spent a very long chapter talking about business model innovation. That topic would, become more popular over the succeeding kind of years. And I'm going to come back to that a little bit. But how do you increase the odds that your business, your firm can generate a unconventional strategy that produces unconventional returns? The other question, though, that was very interesting to me as well was how do you reboot a strategy that's losing its economic effectiveness? And that seemed a great problem for many organizations that got stuck with a legacy strategy that had so much invested in that materially, intellectually, and so on, and a very hard time abandoning or changing that strategy in the face of changing circumstances. So I've kind of dealt with that problem in one way or another through a variety of books I've written since. But again, as a topic, this thing has kind of been losing its luster, and I think that's a problem. And I think it has less to do with whether strategy is important and maybe more around how we think about it, how we describe it, and so on. So let me kind of get into kind of 10 kind of key points. So, my first argument is that, yes, strategy definitely kind of still matters. And yet most companies don't really have a strategy. And so we live in certainly very turbulent times, but we don't live in a post-strategy era. I think any organization that hopes to stay relevant in a world of accelerating change needs a point of view about the future that ensures consistency, that spurs creativity, that inspires bravery. And a strategy has to be broad enough to survive the unexpected, but without it, I think an organization is relatively kind of rudderless. And you still see some examples, I'll go into some of companies that really have done very brave things that clearly had a deep strategic logic behind it. I think of, Apple over the last dozen years or so, from a standing start, would build a deep capacity to design their own chips. That's an enormously esoteric skill, takes years to develop. And you don't do that unless you have a point of view about the future and what's going to be important. So the question I like to ask when I'm talking to a senior group to kind of test whether there's a strategy there or not, I have kind of a simple question. I like to ask them, what are the 3 to 4 ways in which you're going to reinvent yourselves and the world around you? And I'd like to ask each member on the executive team or leadership team to answer this independently and just put a couple of from-to statements on a sheet of paper. Here's what we are today. Here's how we think about our strategy, our identity. Here's what we're aiming for over the next few years. So these have to be like just short little phrases, not some long white paper. And then once you kind of pile all those up, the question I like to ask is a few. Number one, is there any consensus? Do you have a senior team that shares a point of view about that? Or do you have an on-running battle about, are we a solution company? Are we a product company? Are we whatever? But have they gotten to a consensus? Number two, super important, is the strategy differentiated? Is there anything about it that would surprise your competitors? Because you cannot produce differentiated returns without a differentiated strategy. And then thirdly, is it actionable? Have we kind of folded the future back into the present? And can you show me what you're doing in terms of acquisitions, new hires, skills, so on? How are you, what are you doing with this in the next 30 days that makes this real? So you wouldn't be surprised, I don't think, that in most organizations, the answer to these questions is like no, no, and no. And you go like, guys, you're the senior team. What the hell else are you doing if you're not, responsible, accountable for this? And, so this is only my anecdotal evidence, but there was a study a couple of years back by PwC, 6,000 executives, and only a third basically said, yeah, we have a well-defined strategy. Barely a quarter said, well, we think it's innovative in some way. And, 1 out of 8 says, well, we kind of have a roadmap for a new capability. You go like, what the hell are you guys doing? Like, what's your value added at the top here if you're not building strategy? So that's kind of point number 2. Second, and I guess I kind of already said this, strategy still matters a lot. I talked about Apple and kind of their epic quest to develop a new chip. And that came because Apple had this ever-expanding array of digital products, The differentiation in those products depends very much on the silicon. For years, they had been kind of hostage to Intel, Samsung, and others. And they said, well, let's build our own silicon. And the first attempt was quite amazing, 54% faster than any Intel processor, and just an exceptional technical accomplishment. But that took years and years and years to build. And certainly, one of the thoughts here is that strategy has to exist in many different kind of time frames, right? There's things that are strategic agility where you can pivot very quickly, but in terms of building really deep, new to the world capabilities, that's going to take some long time. I think Tesla, whatever you think of Elon Musk, Tesla's had a very consistent, very deep strategy now over about 15 years around electrification, software-defined cars, self-driving vehicles, and vertical and horizontal integration. And pretty much all the rest of the automobile industry, at least as far as EVs are concerned, have been playing catch up. And today, Tesla remains, even though it's slowing down, it remains the world's most valuable car company by quite a long ways. Another kind of key thought for me is that there's actually no such thing as strategic planning. I never use that phrase. I think it's an oxymoron. It's like talking about virtual presence, a man bun, or Scottish cuisine. It's like something that doesn't actually exist. You can certainly do planning. You can do budgeting. You can kind of plot out an existing strategy in terms of action. But planning and strategizing are completely distinct activities. And of course, what you find in most companies is what they call strategic planning is 95% planning and 5% strategizing. And a typical planning process in a large organization looks something like this. And the chances that this creates a breakthrough strategy is zero, right? I mean, you might as well dance naked around a campfire as hope that this is going to actually develop strategy. And in most cases, that planning process is elitist, is formulaic, it's extrapolative, it's a top-down, budget-focused ritual that harnesses only a tiny fraction of the organization's creative imagination, and pretty much the opposite of what I think should be a exciting, participative quest to discover new opportunities. And until that changes, I think large companies will continue to kind of fumble the future. I also believe you cannot build strategies top down, and that the role of the senior team is not to create strategy. They're not the authors of strategy, but perhaps the editors of strategy. And certainly they're responsible for creating a strategy process. But I think it's very dangerous when they are seen as kind of the strategist in chief. A couple of years ago, writing in Harvard Business Review, the then managing partner, now former managing partner, McKinsey, he said this. He said, the G3, the CEO, CFO, CHRO, will shape the destiny of the business by looking forward and at the big picture while everyone else has their heads buried in operations. I literally cannot imagine a more stupid thing to say in business. I mean, the idea that in this immensely complex world, that some small group of people at top has the intellectual capacity, the breadth of vision, the creative capacity to see the future and craft it is just ludicrous. And in fact, when you look at kind of that traditional organizational pyramid, the question you want to ask is, who in that pyramid is most likely to have their intellectual capacity invested, or their intellectual capital, let me say, invested in the past? Where are the executives that feel compelled to justify decisions that were made 10 years ago? And so it's just ironic to me that we concentrate the responsibility for setting strategy at the top. And what that does is it makes the entire organization hostage to the ability and the willingness of a small number of people to unlearn and relearn. And as the great Harvard philosopher Karl Deutsch said, power is the ability to afford not to learn. And so, and I've seen this over and over. I could give you a dozen examples. Let me give you one. Back in 2006, Steve Jobs goes to the CEO of Intel, Paul Otellini, and says, we'd like you to make chips for the iPhone. And by the way, they're going to have to be super small, really, really power efficient, a new architecture. It's going to be hard work, but would you make them? And Intel passes. And kind of justifying that decision a decade later, the CEO says, well, the iPhone turned out to be 100 times more successful than anyone thought. Like, really? Really? If you'd seen the prototype of that and you compared that to what, like, it's just like, and I guarantee you that if he had taken that idea to a group of 30-something engineers at Intel and said, should we be a part of this? They would go like, yeah, obviously, let's go. And by the way, they would miss that. They would miss communication chips, give that to Qualcomm. They would miss the opportunity to create a foundry. That went to TSMC. They missed every single major opportunity for 30 years. And by the way, there was a period when Microsoft was doing the same. So, like, the CEO does not own strategy, is not the strategy in chief. I'll come back to that. I also believe, and I think this is a step that's often missed in strategy making, is to build a differentiated strategy, you have to have differentiated insights. You have to know, and I don't mean suspect or just imagine, but you have to know things based on data, based on evidence, that your competitors don't. Because if you're all starting with the same kind of, well, AI is important, here's how we segment the market. I mean, if you're all taking kind of the same information, the possibility of creating a truly differentiated strategy is very low. So you have to look, we all live in the same world with the same information, but you have to find ways of looking at it in a different way. And so the work I did around this is now many, many years ago. But when I got interested in that question of where do new strategies come from, I went and talked to more than 100 business innovators. And I talked to Richard Branson and Mark Andreessen and Michael Dell and Anita Roddick and so on. And the question was, okay, you live in the same world as the rest of us. How did you see this opportunity? Like, what combination of insights and what you learned, at least what I thought I learned in that was, like, innovation, strategy innovation is not this esoteric, magical, like, wow. I mean, we look at it that way because it happens in somebody's mind and it's kind of a black box. But in fact, what I saw again and again was 4 perceptual habits that allowed people to see around corners, see over the horizon, and see what others could not. And one of those was these people all questioned conventional wisdom. They were mostly outsiders. And as you all would know, in an industry over time, you get a set of conventions, a set of orthodoxies that are widely shared in common. Everybody in that industry thinks the same way and therefore is all blind in the same way. And so I believe deeply, deeply that the starting point for any exercise on strategy has to be a systematic effort to deconstruct what you already believe. And we have some very deep tools and processes for doing this, but essentially you're looking across all the business models in an industry and saying, what does everybody hold in common? Where do you see a great overlap? And where you see the overlap, is that because this is literally the only way to compete, or this is just the dead hand of tradition around our neck? You also want to look at every element of the company's legacy strategy and say, how long has it been since we changed that or really question that? So let me give you, again, I could give you many examples. Like, John Bogle comes along and says, hey, maybe index funds outperform managed funds. That creates, the foundation for Fidelity, now, one of the largest financial firms in the world. But let me give you another example. Over the last decade, we saw this explosion in yoga wear with Lululemon, the leader there, now kind of worth as much as Adidas. And yet, if you'd gone to Puma, Adidas, Nike, New Balance a few years back, and you go like, guys, what is a sport? And they said, like, well, it's men in uniform kicking the shit out of a ball. And by the way, there are no rules in yoga. There's no referee. There's not even how can this be a sport? And yet, of course, it turned out to be an extraordinary opportunity. That's just blindness. So you have to work to do that. The second is being super alert to what's changing in the world, and particularly looking at things that are accelerating and that your competitors are not paying attention to. And by the time a technology or trend becomes kind of part of the public conversation, it may be too late to create any economic value out of that. And again, let me give you an example. Way back in kind of early 1990s, somebody from AT&T showed me this chart. And they said, as we look forward, over the next 20, 30 years, we think we're going to have increasing bandwidth in our homes. And at some point, we'll all have gigabit bandwidth. At the same time, what we see is a decreasing amount of bandwidth that's required for video compression. And so they projected, this is again, early 90s, they projected that sometime around 2005, streaming becomes possible. And that's exactly what happened, right? YouTube, Apple TV all come out, Netflix around this time. And you go like, why wasn't the rest of the industry paying attention to this? And Lily, I heard a very senior executive at NBC Universal, big US television network. This was 2016. By the way, in 2016, people under 35 years old were already consuming 2/3 of their video content through streaming, right? This has already happened. In 2016, this guy stands in front of hundreds of advertisers and says Netflix does not have enough good content to make it interesting, and YouTube is a sidebar. And you go like, what the hell have you been paying attention to? And I think what that illustrates is most companies missed the future, not because it was unpredictable, but because it was unpalatable. So another kind of deep perspective here is really thinking, and again, we saw this again and again from these kind of industry revolutionaries, is looking at your firm, not in terms of products, but in terms of deep capability. So products come and go, but deep capabilities are the wellspring for innovation. So you look at something quite unexpected. How does Amazon become the world leader in cloud computing? Well, because they learned a lot about how you run large-scale internet infrastructure. And you go like, and in fact, they had done a study around what are our really deep competencies, and this came out of that thought process. It was very significant when Apple, under Steve Jobs, changed its name from Apple Computer to Apple. So one of the key parts of any strategy process is really going deeper in what is our self-identity. Because how you define yourself sets the limits on what you think is your opportunity horizon. Finally, and maybe most obviously, innovators pay attention to people's frustrations or to their emotional states. You know, in a lot of industries, the incumbents all just assume that it's okay to piss customers off. You know, my bank, one of my banks, Barclays Bank, you know, I banked with them for 40 years. And when I call them, I'm talking to somebody on the other side of the planet who doesn't know who the hell I am, knows nothing about my financial life. And this is just typical. Again, let me go back to Apple for a moment. Someone there that I got to know, the guy who created Apple Stores, Apple Retail, Ron Johnson, you know, he said this at the time. He said, we wanted to create a very distinct experience for customers in what they would perceive as a public space, more like a great library, which has natural light and feels like a gift to the community. Now, today, we just take Apple stores for granted. They're part of, you know, just what's out there. But I can tell you at the time, you look at, for example, the Apple store in Chicago on the lake there, or sorry, on the river there, you know, this is not a typical retail structure. And when I ask people in retailing, like I say, could you get this store past your CFO? Like, no, this is very expensive to build. But Apple understood we are trying to create an emotional state in people. You know, this hit me. I remember many years ago having a conversation with the executive team at Ford. At the time, Honda was making the best engines in the world. They were in Formula One. They made these 4-valve per cylinder, 4-cylinder engines, high revving, beautiful. And everyone says, like on the boot, on the truck, it says 16V. I said to Ford, why don't you make any 16-valve 4-cylinder engines? They said, because it costs $68 more. I said, yeah, but every 18-year-old kid will pay you $250 more. And yet, you know, they had people understood everything about cost and nothing about perceived value. And so another critical part of strategy making is a very concerted effort to understand the emotional states of customers, and then how do you re-engineer those in ways that you kind of increase the quantum of satisfaction. So whenever I've done strategy work through the years, we tend to create teams that go hard on each one of those perspectives. a team that looks really deeply on kind of what are the habits that have developed in our industry? What are the orthodoxies? Which of those is gravity? Which of those is not? A team that will look very deeply into what's changing in the world, what's accelerating, and what is going mostly unnoticed. A team that looks at kind of redefining corporate identity, deep capabilities and strengths, and then a team that's kind of looking at the unarticulated needs. And in my experience, the really strong strategy ideas come as typically a combination of those insights, not just one, but it's when you put them together. We did something a couple years back for a Korean company, I won't tell you who, but we had young teams doing this work, building out this foundation of insights, hundreds of insights. And then we set each of these teams in a day. We had 6 or 7 people around a table, a big screen at each table. And we would randomly bring up some of these insights, a technology, just like you see, a habit, a trend, a strength. And we say, guys, what do you see as an opportunity at the intersection of these insights? And literally, they're generating thousands of really reality-based, data-based strategy insights in a matter of a day or two, which typically companies really don't do this at all. Another thought, the best ideas are going to come from unexpected places. So often the strategy conversation is kind of the same people talking to the same people year after year, no new insights. It's a stuffy room with closed door and closed windows. And so whenever I've worked on strategy, I want to bring new voices into that conversation. People who've worked in other industries, who are a long ways from head office, who maybe represent underrepresented demographics, people who are young, and so on. And then, customers and partners. And typically, these people are underrepresented in the strategy conversation. I think they should always be overrepresented in that conversation. So again, I don't know. Well, we can speculate on why these people totally don't get a hearing, but they need to be much more fully represented than they are. Last few points. In creating strategies, I think it's important to diverge before you converge. So this is a little map of kind of the strategy process I've used through the years. It starts with that kind of discovery, going out, looking at trends, looking at unmet needs and so on, and building, hundreds, thousands of data points, and then starting to look across those and say, what are the deep insights here? Then once I have the insights, as I was just describing, I can start to generate opportunities. And by the way, that step of building insights is almost always missed, right? We go right to the opportunities. Well, yeah, but we're not working off of any fresh insights. But then once you have created maybe 1,000 different opportunities, which is not unreasonable to expect, then you have to kind of start looking for the themes. And I think it's often the themes are more important than the individual ideas. Let me give you a quick example. Again, back in early 1990s, we built one of the first innovation markets for Shell, the oil company. And with primitive technology, we made it possible for people across 170 countries to say, what do I think is a game-changing idea? The first time we did that, 1/3 of the ideas from around the world were renewable energy. There was not a single senior person at Shell, as far as I know, at that time that was thinking about renewables. And when you go out to the people on the fringes all over the world, and the ideas were very different. There was biomass and there's solar and so on, but clearly you could see this is really going to be important. And so let me, and so this point about diverging is important because, innovation is always a numbers game. I live in Northern California. I'm looking out my window at these live oak trees, and on the ground at a certain time of year, you'll find thousands of acorns. And that's because the oak tree doesn't know where the fertile ground is. So the acorns are a search strategy, and some will germinate, most won't. And I think in the same way, an organization needs a search strategy. You need to create hundreds or thousands, and I'm being quite literal here, in terms of strategic options, right? And then you start to look for the themes. Jeff Bezos years ago at Amazon, he said, our goal was to build the world's biggest laboratory. We're simply going to try more things. So now the themes may be more important than the ideas. And let me give a little visual here. If you imagine, a process that's generating hundreds or even thousands of new strategic ideas, one of the real jobs is then to look across those and start to ask, okay, what across all of those, are there bigger themes that we can identify? Because what you'll often find is the idea by itself is not very interesting. But when you start to look at them together, you go, okay, this is something very big. And that was true at Shell. By the way, let me back up and say one thing. If you want to create strategy, you have to teach people to think in the ways I was describing. You have to teach them how to challenge orthodoxy. You have to teach them, what a rule-breaking strategy looks like. You have to teach them how to go after those unarticulated needs. And I think many companies have put up some kind of an idea wiki or something else and are typically quite disappointed because the ideas are either very incremental or they're flights of fancy. And that's what you get, right? Don't ask the ignorant for an informed opinion. Let me give you, again, a quick example, and I know I'm a little over time, but I'm just about finished. So let me give you a very quick example. So many years ago, I got asked to go to Finland to a little company I'd never heard of called Nokia. And up in Espoo, second largest city in Finland. And I got this call saying, we want to kill Motorola. I said, wait, Motorola is number one in mobile phones. They invented the mobile phone. They're a very capable organization. But I like your chutzpah. I'm happy to come talk to you. And so in the end, we created the first of what would become many through the years, an open strategy process. We involved hundreds of people at Nokia. We divided them in those teams. And they went out and built hundreds of insights, generated thousands of different kind of strategic ideas. But when we started to look at those thematically, three large themes emerged. And I called this in a book I wrote in 1994, I call this strategic architecture. So there are a whole set of ideas on how do you move the phone beyond voice. How do you, and we were experimenting with using it for payment and obviously texting, photographs and so on. But clearly this was going to be much more than just a voice thing. It was also clear this had the potential to be a lifestyle device. So the time we did this work, there were 500,000 mobile accounts in the world. And I remember standing in front of the group there at Nokia saying, what would it take to sell 1 billion mobile phones a year? They thought I was insane. But I said, clearly, you have to go after kids. This is not a tool for yuppies, business people, professionals. And that means, by the way, radically reducing the cost. And then finally, there was the idea that, okay, how do you get all of the telco operators to quickly adopt this new thing? And that meant going to them with the infrastructure, the billing systems, and so on and whatever. So this is about circa 1993, 1994. And at the end of it, as we kind of sat and we looked at all of this, and we said, okay, what's the real essence of the strategy? What's the kind of intent? What came out of that was the remote control for life. So this is 1993. Now, here's the dilemma. And by the way, Nokia would go on to dominate that industry. But here's the dilemma. All those young people I worked with in the early 90s, they were 30 years old, 35 years old, Pekka Ala-Pietala and Sari Baldauf and so on. By the time 10 years has gone by, they're spectacularly rich. People are calling Nokia the best managed technology company in the world, and they never went back into this again. And so that made them vulnerable to Apple and so on. So this is not something that you do once, but so on. So I guess what you've heard from me last 2 points is that open is better than closed. I think the strategy process needs to have hundreds or thousands of voices in it. We did a project a couple of years back with Adidas here in North America. They have about 3,000 employees. Everyone was part of that process. We trained everyone to think like a business innovator. They generated more than 4,000 ideas. There were more than 9,000 peer-to-peer ratings and so on and so on. This is how you find the future. And that kind of leads to my last point. The technology can be a huge multiplier here. We've been using technology in one way or another now for 30, 40 years doing this. And now have our own platform that allows us to bring together thousands of people to do this work quite quickly and productively. But I'm going to show you a slide I created in 1995. And as we were starting to do this work, and I thought, you know what, technology, making this open, making it peer-to-peer, can help improve the strategy process, right? We get a lot more data and insight into it. We get new voices. We can increase the speed and efficiency of the process. You can make it much more experiential. You can strengthen the credibility because you can go back and understand where all of this came from, and so on and so on. And I would say, despite that, here we are these many years later, very, very few companies have yet created an open strategy process that looks anything like that. So that's one of my regrets. Maybe we talk about why, but Morten, back to you.
Gary, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate. Is it okay for you to share a copy of the material you shared?
Sure, happy to.
Perfect. Thank you. Then I'll distribute it. Just one question for me before we open it up. What's the things? I mean, because you have been on to bureaucracy and revolutionizing strategy for as long as I have been even knowing about the word. Recently, what are the things that have surprised you the most, or that you have been seeing changing to maybe how your messages are received? You started by saying that there is not enough attention being paid to strategy at the moment. It's a bit like a topic that's fading away. Not sure I remember your words right, but are you seeing anything around the appetite for strategy changing, or anything that make the world more receptive of your ideas?
No, not now. When you say receptive to my ideas, I have a variety of ideas, but with respect to strategy, and let me give maybe a very quick thought on why that may be. I think there are two things. I think one, strategy became equated with planning, and so we just sucked the life out of strategy. I mean, that is not creating strategy. Number one. Number two, and by the way, if you look at the academic literature on this, which I don't read much, but there was a time back 20, 30 years ago when there was, if you look at the Strategic Management Journal and so on, there was a lot of interest in the strategy process. And again, it was mostly planning, but there was at least a lot. I don't read anything really anymore about process, right? And yet all of this requires a process, right? It requires discipline and staging and participation and so on. So I think one, we got marooned on strategic planning. Number two, we've thought much less and less about process. I think the idea of an open strategy, and by the way, I have a couple of friends who've written a very good book recently about open strategy. I would recommend that to you. But it is very disconcerting to a CEO to say, "Hey, you're not going to create strategy. You don't even know when we start this process. You have no idea where we're going to end up." So when we did this work a few years back at Autodesk, the CEO of North America, Autodesk in North America, he said, "Guys, our strategy sucks. Like, it's a Me Too strategy. We're on the back foot. We need to create a new strategy." And I can tell you, the people in the executive suite, we do not know how to do it. If we'd known how to do this, we would already have done it. So it took a huge dose of humility to go out to the organization and say that. One last point on why this and maybe a lot of other important issues have fallen by the wayside. If you look, and I'm going to give you US data because I'm most familiar, but just bear with me for a moment. I want you to think about the last 60 years and divide it into two 30-year tranches. So if you look from basically 95 or so to present, last 30 years, US corporate profitability has grown at 5% a year, real terms. If you take the previous 30 years, it grew at 2%. You go like, wow, like that's unbelievable. Like our profit was going, and now for 30 years, profits have gone like this. And you go, man, we must have like really brilliant CEOs and well-managed companies. Well, when you dig into this, as some economists have, virtually all of that increase is explained by three things. Number one, it is lower borrowing costs. About half of it just comes from the fact we've had record low interest rates until very recently. Number two, a huge part of it comes from consolidation and therefore pricing power. So the average, what economists would call markup, it's kind of like margin. But if you go back 30 years ago, the average markup for America's largest companies was 21%. It's now 71%. So, and if you look at airlines, telecommunications, hotels, retailing, huge consolidation, that means trillions of dollars a year are going from the pockets of consumers to the pockets of companies with a lot of pricing power. So that's the second thing. The third thing was China and the opportunity, for a much larger market and also for wage arbitrage, which pushed down costs and therefore profits. That explains all of this growth and profitability. But what's happened over the last few years, if you're a CEO, that has lifted all boats. And then on top of that, you see record number of share buybacks, huge amount of financial engineering. So there have just been way easier ways of creating the illusion of resilience than actually having to build really great strategy and so on. So I think, and by the way, again, if you go back 30 years ago, the average CEO was paid about 20 to 40 times as much as a frontline employee. Now that average is more than 300 times. So, but I will tell you, we've been paying skippers for the wind. It's not that our CEOs are any better. In fact, arguably they're worse. And what you find, and I'll just give you these last two data points, it's quite interesting. Two economists looked at America's superstar companies. So these are top companies by market cap, the 20 top companies by market cap, and then the top 4 companies in every industry by market cap. They call them the superstars. 20 years ago, those companies had productivity growth that was higher than the average for the economy. Last 20 years, their productivity growth has been lower than the economy. They are now becoming a net drag. Also, last data point, I promise, but kind of interesting. If you take the 100 largest companies in the United States by revenue, over the last 20 years, more than half of them did not grow as fast as GDP. Their revenue as fast as GDP. And of the ones that did grow revenue as fast as GDP, most were in healthcare and retailing, which have had very rapid consolidation and way below average productivity growth. If I go back for the previous 20 years, only a quarter of companies failed to grow as fast as GNP or GDP. So what we're seeing is increasing mediocrity, I think, just across large companies around the world. And you find the same thing in Europe. So I think, and yet we've been able to have this illusion of growth and prosperity and so on, but it has nothing to do with strategy or leadership or any of those things. But it's meant that companies didn't have to think very deeply about strategy.
Thank you. Let's open it up a little bit. And since we are a bit short of time, we will aim to end at the full hour. Let's try to keep questions a bit short. Please. First person, just speak out. Otherwise, please use your hand. Maro.
Yeah, a quick one for you, Gary. I wonder, what do you think is the effect that mass market consulting, so-called strategy consulting, has had on strategy in the past 30 years?
Can you define what you mean by mass consulting?
So mass market strategy consulting is basically, commoditizing strategy consulting, like the slide you showed about the quote from the person from the managing partner from McKinsey.
Yeah. Well, my evidence is anecdotal, but here's a couple of things I see. One is, I think, even the first tier consulting companies like Bain, BCG, McKinsey, and so on are doing less and less strategy work. It's operations, it's digital, and it's M&A. I think would be, and I should say also organizational transformation, but kind of often more about overhead cost reduction or maybe upskilling in some areas, but they're not working on strategy as much as they used to. I think I would be surprised if it's even 20% of the core work in these companies. The other thing is that most consulting companies are now organized by industry. And I get that, there's a logic to that. But, what I tell, the companies I work with is almost everything that's important for you to learn, you have to learn outside your industry. There's just like, you're not going to get any new insights by looking at people you've been competing with for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so I think, when you have a consultant going into a bank saying, hey, yeah, I have this deep experience in financial services, like, what's the chance they're going to help you at all? Like, maybe operationally. And so if you actually look at what most consulting does, it gets the ox out of the ditch. It's about, like, lifting up like the sub mediocre to mediocre. Very little of the work they do is built on creating new to the world advantage. In fact, I say to CIOs, CAOs, I say, I want you to look at all of the money you're spending on consulting, and I ask, across all those projects, how many of those projects have the chance of helping you do something that's never been done before, versus you're just doing your thing with AI and your thing with big data and your thing with whatever the latest thing is. You know, and it's interesting if you look at, so digital has obviously been one of the biggest trends in the world for now a long time. It is almost impossible to find one incumbent company that's been ahead of that trend. All of big pharma got behind biotech. All of legacy media was behind streaming. Almost all bricks and mortar retailers were behind e-commerce, right? And I can just go down that list. You go like, what the hell are you guys doing? Like, whatever you're spending on strategy, whatever you're doing, all of your kind of digital transformation is basically catch up. And so I think, again, if you don't have a strategy process that's really focused on understanding, intercepting these new things, and you're waiting until some consultant comes and tells you, hey, all of your competitors are doing this, then you're just always on the back foot. And that's why virtually every so-called change program is actually a catch-up program. So I don't think consultants bring fresh insights. They don't, or very seldom. And most of them don't have a process for generating fresh insights.
Gary, in the absence of hands, so please raise your hand if you have some questions or comments. I have a question for you. You had this wonderful phrase that we are paying the skippers for the wind. And I was just wondering, do you see any signs that that wind is changing, maybe even to something else? We're in the middle of a huge period of digitizing work, for example, that will probably have impact on how we need to think about strategy, organizations, etc. You could even argue that there seems to be a bit of a catch-22 in where some organizations are. Any observations along those lines? In what?
Yeah, and there's some things going on there that kind of make me optimistic that we may have a chance to get people to take some of this seriously again. So those things that were kind of lifting all the boats, the tide is now running out. So interest rates are going higher, or higher, and probably will stay higher. So that, that's gone. By the way, the other big thing that happened in the US was we had a basically effective corporate tax rates got cut in half. They're not going to get cut in half again. Share buybacks, right? Like, okay, $800 billion a year of share buybacks. There's a limit to that. There's a limit to consolidation. So I think many of the things that kind of companies relied on over the last decade are running out of steam. And so people like Goldman Sachs are now saying, share prices in the US appreciated about 10% per year over the last decade. Goldman is now saying at best it's going to be 3% a year over the next decade. So I think, there's a good chance that as we go forward, finally companies are going to have to earn their own success, right? And it will be a less benign environment, and therefore maybe a bigger premium on companies that really do the hard work of thinking about the future.
Thank you. I have another one. I secretly enjoyed the list that you shared in the beginning, where you talked about, of course, clarity, absolutely, but you talked about being actionable. And then you talked about reinventing both yourself and your environment. I have used the word transformative for that. You're changing the rules and the game, etc. I think you could observe another trend, in a sense, is that as things are getting pushed into the organization, also the idea of strategy becomes more fractal and more localized. So have you seen any signs in a way that rather than strategy being the thing guiding what happens, actually it's almost like you have a mesh of local strategies that get integrated up to corporate strategy, and it's almost like a network of strategies talking to each other. Of course, it needs to make sense, but there are strategy in many places in the organization that you need to figure out to integrate.
It's not that, it's not that people are not thinking about strategy. They don't always use that term, but they're, how do I get an advantage? How do I position myself in this marketplace? What do I do? What do I don't do? So, there are a lot of strategic decisions that are being made all the time. And if you go back and as people like Bob Bergelman and others have done, if you go back and you look inside of large companies, you say, where do new strategies come from? They typically emerge more bottom up. And if I go back to Intel when they were still firing on all cylinders, when they made the move from memory chips to microprocessors, that was like a renegade group low in the company starting to work on this, getting a little bit of traction. And people go like, oh, that's quite interesting. Like, yeah, maybe we should really invest there. So that is how strategy emerges. New strategies emerge. My argument is there's a way of turbocharging that process and not just like hoping that it's going to happen, right? I mean, one of the things that you probably have all heard somebody say, they'll say, strategy is the easy part, implementation is the hard part. I think that's a rubbish. I think if the goal is to build a truly game-changing strategy, I can tell you there's nothing easy about that, right? And even if you look at Elon Musk and Tesla, he came into to Tesla after the company already existed. A lot of that strategy is already there. People have spent years thinking about what the opportunity might be, and so it is not easy. Now, it can be. As I say, you can systematize it in a way, and I've talked a little bit about how to do that. But here's one of the reasons that the implementation is often hard is when strategies are created kind of by a very small number of people, kind of offline, as it were. You then come to the organization and say, here's our strategy. And by that point, it's like a few words or a couple of charts. And the organization was like, how did you get that? Like, where did that come from? And by the way, did you look at all of these other things? And so I think that the advantages of doing something that is more open and participative is you do get those ideas that are low in the organization that otherwise would be ignored. And by the way, it's quite interesting. If you have 300 employees, let's say, out of a few thousand who go like, that's a really great idea, we're all going to give a big thumbs up. It is very hard for some stuck in the mud SVP to say, no, that's not, we're not going to do that. I think about Eric Yuan, who was one of the first employees at WebEx. WebEx gets bought by Cisco. And Eric spends the next 5 years trying to get Cisco to make video conferencing a consumer product, not just like a corporate thing. They tell him, no, we're a B2B company. He leaves and starts Zoom, right? Well, I want a process where Eric puts that idea forward. You have 200 people who say, Eric, this is like freaking brilliant. You can start to model that out and then you go do it. And when the process is transparent like that, by the time you get to the end and it's been open the whole way, everybody knows what were the insights we started with. Were they well grounded? What were the ideas we generated? How are they ranked? How do they hang together thematically? Why are we going where we're going? And so this long lag between the formulation and the implementation kind of disappears. People are ready to march and let's go do this. So I think your insight is right. The truly creative strategies almost never come top down, but you shouldn't have to have enormous patience and courage and have to fight the bloody system as maybe a young person to get somebody to hear that idea.
Thank you. Ken, please go ahead.
Hi, Gary. Two things. Can you hear me okay? Yes, I think you can.
Yes.
What's the difference? How do you see the difference between strategy and problem solving, Gary?
Well, I think strategy is just the strategy process solves a particular question, which is like, how do we define our destiny? And how do we define the primary vectors along which we're going to reinvent ourselves? That's for me the essence of strategy. But it is part of a broader kind of problem-solving milieu. I mean, more and more, I've thought, Ken, that you can kind of look at any company and measure its net problem-solving capacity. So if you believe if you believe that there's basically an infinite number of interesting problems to solve, which I do, the question as an organization is how good are we at solving new problems? And when you look inside of organizations and you discover that, this Gallup data that only 1 in 5 employees believe their opinions matter at work. Only 1 in 8 say they can influence decisions. Only 1 in 11 say they can experiment. When companies do not train frontline people to think like business people, when they have no financial upside in the solutions they create, all the evidence says, and that's another conversation, that we basically waste more human capacity than we use, and the inherent, and so the potential problem solving capacity of an organization, we're hardly even touching that, I think, in most large companies. And part of that is a legacy of the bureaucratic era where the assumption was the thinkers are at the top and the doers are at the bottom. And, and we still, and the data says we still are running an intellectual caste system inside of our companies. And it's like stupid in this day and age, but, it's a legacy of that old model.
And second thing, it's related to that point, actually, because I think you're trying to democratize the kind of information sharing. You mentioned the platform that you use. Is that something that's readily available, or is it
well, it's not something that is, a platform out there, but whenever we do work in a company, we stand the platform up inside of their firewall. It just becomes a button on the home site. So we just port all the code over. So, but I want to go back to that point about problem solving, and also about, and link this back to Morten's last point. I saw a really interesting example of this recently. Some folks at KKR, the big private equity company, started kind of recognizing just the limits of their value model, where you replace the leadership and you drive out a lot of costs and so on. And a particular group of people there started thinking about what's the power of shared ownership. So they kind of put together a couple of companies, but a 110-year-old U.S. manufacturing company called, the name's going to escape me, come back to me. But in any case, they make pumps and other things. They gave employees a $250 million stock grant. They didn't invest, nothing you had to do, just like, here's money, right? Made them all owners. Then they spent 6 months teaching every employee how to think like a business person, particularly around working capital and cash conservation and so on, and asked them, like, where do you see opportunities for us to be more efficient as a business? Hundreds of millions of dollars. The next round was, we're going to teach everybody to think about strategy. We're going to teach them about AI. We're going to teach them about our customers. We're going to, whatever is important. And then their strategy process now starts every year, where every team, these are mostly blue collar employees, every team is like, what do you see changing? What do you think is the opportunity for us to do something new? And those things all bubble up, go through peer review, and that's how strategy emerges now in this company. And I think their first distribution of these of shares was around 2000. They've tripled the share price since then by saying, like, everybody's a potential strategist. I'm looking out over Silicon Valley this morning, and most of the business ideas here come from kids. And they do not come from industry veterans and experts and so on. And like we kind of know that. So why the hell don't we replicate that inside of our organizations?
Okay, great. Thanks, Gary. Conscious of time. Thank
Gary,
you.
thank you so much for taking time to join us. We are just about to be at the top of the hour. I want to honor everybody's time. Anything we can do for you?
No, if you want to, you can find me on LinkedIn, just with my name on X. I'm Prof. Hamel, but I post occasionally on LinkedIn if I have a new thought or whatever, or have time. So happy to connect with you there. And if you have another question, you can just ask me a question there. I'll try to answer it.
Thank you very much.
All
have
right.
a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thanks for the great questions. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good.
Thank you.